Harry Reese also designed these 4 river cottages that are coming up on our left-hand side here. Loves the use of the triangular shape. He was very much of an avid sailor. We like to call him Mr. Triangle, and I'll show you Mr. Rectangle a little bit later on with Mies van der Rohe, and Mr. Circle with Bertram Goldberg. So 4 river cottages, and Harry Reese was also a big believer in this river, and it was kind of a catalyst for getting people to start paying more attention to our riverfront area, and I'll tell you more about that in just a little bit here. These buildings, again, were completed in 1988, and none of them, they all had the original owners up until a few months ago. One home was finally sold. It's undergoing a renovation now. As we come out from under the bridge here, we're going to both look right and left. First of all, on the right-hand side, this is the East Bank Club. It goes back to 1979, designed by Ezra Gordon and Jack Levin. And you're looking at one of the largest, most successful health clubs anywhere. It's got well over 10,000 members, 4 swimming pools, jogging trails, restaurant shops. Truly is a first-class facility. This is where President Obama did his workouts prior to becoming our president. Our mayor works out here. Oprah used to work out here. What I want you to look at, though, is how it turns its back on the river. Those windows up in the top there, those are up in the locker rooms. And trust me, you can't even see from inside looking out. Now turn around and look the other way. Same developer, this is a different architect, Papa George Haynes from 2002. Look at how we embrace the river. You've got the river walk, you've got the gardens, you've got the trees, you've got flowers, you've got usually somebody walking a dog or pushing a baby carriage, but I don't see anybody doing that today. Even has some public art that's coming up here on the left-hand side. The difference is time. 1979, nobody wanted to look at this river back in those days. I think back then we were considered to be like highly toxic. I think we're now something like highly polluted, but the point is it's become kind of an amenity here in Chicago, and we began to embrace this river, and this element of time has come into play quite a bit on the tour here today. And here's some public art coming up on the left-hand side here. Something very much emphasized here in Chicago. If you go in the downtown area, all kinds of public plazas and very famous artists represented here in Chicago. You get all kinds of brownie points for putting in public art, so we're very kind of proud of that. Okay, back in the 1960s, we had a thing called suburban sprawl, not only in Chicago, but in a lot of major cities where, you know, the suburban areas begin to grow up and the downtown areas become somewhat abandoned. And back in those days, we had a thing called urban renewal. That's when we kind of tore down a lot of those older buildings and replaced them with a lot of new modern-day skyscrapers to kind of keep that downtown area alive and vibrant. So nowadays, we've got a new saying, and that new saying is called adaptive reuse. That's when we began to take a lot of these older buildings, make them into more modern-day uses. Perfect example on the right-hand side here as we come out from under the bridge here. This is an old warehouse building. Goes all the way back to 1909, designed by Nibbins and Fellows and converted into residential space. And by the way, anytime you see those hanging balconies, you can pretty well rest assured that it has been converted into residential space. Now, I think a lot of this happened after they tore down the old Penn Station in New York and the old Chicago Stock Exchange. All of a sudden, preservationist groups began to kind of grow up and get a little bit more power, and we began to take a lot of these buildings and make them into more contemporary uses. And it's very prevalent now in this River North area that we're traveling through. We did leave the main business district when we left the main branch. This was formerly very much of a commercial industrial area that's seen a lot of these types of conversions. Some of what you see along the river here today, a lot more, a little bit more to the right or to the east of us and even to the west of us. And by the way, this whole property on the left-hand side just came out in the paper the other day that there's new development that's going to be going in here, which, you know, they're seeking approval on. So this whole area is going to be developed in the next couple of years or so. The Montgomery Ward Park on the right-hand side, I want you to look at, I'll tell you more about him in just a bit, but look at the 2 buildings that kind of flank the park. Not the one in the center with the hanging balconies, but the gray and white buildings to the right and left of it. If you look at the top window, what do you see up there? You see the mechanicals of the building. Well, that's something you normally cover up, put behind a wall, but the architecture, Lucien Lagrange, has a little bit of a different philosophy. He celebrates the structure. You can see the mechanicals. You can see those triangular trusses that go up the side of the building. If you peek through the trees, you can see the columns, what's known as the piers, going down to bedrock that support the building, all opened and exposed. And something, it's a little bit different in that it is a residential condominium building, and it's much easier to sell condominiums in kind of this kind of cookie-cutter fashion, one on top of the other. But you can see these are unusual shapes, unusual angles there. You even have columns going right to the center of steel beams going right to the center of some of those apartments here. So definitely that's something that's definitely a little bit different when it comes to that type of construction. These are from 2002 and 2004. And Lucien Lagrange, by the way, retired several years ago, but then recently just came out of retirement. You might tell in the Because those people are walking their dogs outside of the dog park. But anyway, we started to name these parks. I'm not sure what they call this guy, but if you go in Grant Park, you'll find Grant Park over there. I'm reading my whole thing here. Anyway, if you go by Wrigley Field, you'll find Wrigley Field. But again, I'm not sure what they call this guy. These two buildings on the right-hand side here, both designed by that same firm right we looked at across from East Bank, Papa George Haynes from 2005 and 2006. Condominium buildings. The Architecture Foundation had a presentation by this firm shortly after they completed. One of the questions we asked was why the color? And their explanation was they thought this riverfront area was dull. They wanted to brighten it up. They cited some European cities as an example. Copenhagen was actually a major inspiration. It's a city I had a chance to visit a couple of years ago. And trust me, since these buildings have gone up, in addition to the park, we've seen a lot of these types of, kind of brighten up, so to speak, along the riverfront here. Next up on the right, 3 buildings in a row, all part of the old Montgomery Ward complex. Montgomery Ward, an old wholesaler, retailer, been out of business about 20 years or so. One of the saviors of Chicago, which I'll tell you about a little bit later on, and also one of the pioneers of the mail order business. First building we'll look at is an old warehouse building from 1930 on the right-hand side, designed by Willis McCauley. They have the hanging balconies, so we know, of course, it's been converted into residential space. What I want you to look at is along the river's edge here, that outside wall. How they kind of carved out a riverwalk there. I mean, they don't have to do that. This building is kind of grandfathered in there, but they see as this riverwalk area gets more and more vibrant, to kind of geared up to put any kind of restaurants or shops or whatever underneath there. Doesn't look like a lot's going underneath there now, but maybe next year. I said the same thing last year, the year before, but hopefully something will come out of that in the next couple of years or so. Next up on the right is the main part of the old Montgomery Ward complex. This is the oldest. It's from 1908, one of the largest buildings in the world when it was completed, designed by Richard Smith, a Schmidt Gardner Martin. Same exact treatment of the outside wall there. In this case, a little bit more active area, restaurant, bar underneath there, very popular, and especially in the summer months there. No hanging balconies here because it's converted into commercial space, with the exception of the part straight in front of you where it gets up taller. That part is residential. You can see how we punched out the balconies up there because in Chicago everybody loves that outdoor space, even though we have such a limited time to enjoy it here in Chicago. Now this is a little bit more of a prairie style where that horizontal plane becomes a lot more dominant, kind of like what we saw in the Apple Store. This is a style that was popularized by Frank Lloyd Wright, who did a lot of his work in the Chicago area, mostly in residential and mostly out in the suburban areas, although he did do some of his early work in some early Chicago skyscrapers. Not this building, however, but again, kind of accentuating that horizontal plane. By the way, this is a commercial building that was not doing very well. There was a tremendous amount of vacancies in this building when it was converted, but a small little company moved in there that seems to get bigger and bigger. This is the national headquarters for Groupon, so that and a lot of startup companies have really begun to occupy the space in this building here. All right, if you look on the right-hand side here, you can see the river branches on the right and branches on the left, and it forms an island, officially known as Ogden Island. If you ask people from Chicago if they've ever heard of Ogden Island, they're going to have no idea what you're talking about, because we all call it Goose Island for the Irish immigrants that used to raise geese there back in the early 1800s, but the official name is Ogden Island, named after our first mayor. Had a brickmaking factory there and actually directed out the area there. By the way, the right over there, you can see on the other side of the bridge over there, we see the barge over there. That's a cement making factory over there. If we see a barge on the river today, I can pretty well guarantee they'll be going to or from that cement making factory. It used to be that these bridges were tendered 24 hours a day because of all the commercial traffic. No longer the case. They really pretty much only go up now for sailboats, mostly in the springtime when they're going from dry dock into the lakefront, and they're now beginning to reverse that process. Those bridges, by the way, occur on Wednesdays and Saturdays, so if you're around for that, it's kind of a fun thing to watch. Kind of two groups of bridge tenders. It's kind of a leapfrog process. They go in these large flotillas. It's kind of starts off sober on one side, not quite sure it ends up on the other side, but it's kind of a fun thing to watch if you happen to be around here today. So again, these bridges are no longer operable, 24 hours a day like in the old days of the commercial days. Okay, straight up in front of us, above that sign that says Groupon, that's that statue you can see, which is called the Spirit of Progress and Commerce by George Mulligan. And kind of sitting right on top of that building is the newest and the latest of the Montgomery Ward complex. This building going back to 1974, designed by Minoru Yamasaki. Some of you may be familiar with that name. This is the gentleman that designed the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center in New York City. If you look, you can see that there's solid corners, 2 on this side, and of course 2 on the other side that we can't quite see from this angle. And there's a reason for those solid corners. The reason being is Montgomery Ward believed in a very egalitarian type of a workforce. What better way to enforce that? Nobody's got the advantages of a corner office. I have an interesting philosophy, and I'll show you the exact opposite philosophy a little bit later on the tour here today. So that's where things like the elevator banks and the mechanicals and the bathrooms and everything will be pushed out to the corner. However, this building has also been converted into condominiums. Another example of that adaptive reuse. All right, as we come out from under the bridge here, look on the right-hand side, the Chicago Tribune Freedom Center. This is Chicago Tribune is one of our larger daily newspapers. This is where they print the newspaper. It's not written at this site, but it is printed here. They believe they also print the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal Chicago editions, as well as a rival newspaper, the Chicago Sun-Times, is also printed here as well. This building going back to 1981, designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. Again, this is 1981. This is that era of nobody really paying much attention to the river. The offices in this building, they're on the other side. They face a parking lot. So back then it was considered more desirable to look at a parking lot than it was to look at the river, the element of time that we've been talking about. Now, there was an article that was written several years back that listed 10 of the ugliest buildings in Chicago. I know you're going to be completely surprised by this, but the building on the right-hand side did make that top 10 list. The article, by the way, written by Chicago Tribune architecture critic, so at least kind of acknowledging the mistake. And again, we can compare the right, we can compare the left, and you know, how we turn our back and embrace it. And I've got more examples to show you that as we go along here today. Okay, so we make our way towards the South Branch. We can talk a little bit of history. Chicago was the fastest growing city in the world in the 1800s. We had a population of right around 0 in 1800. By 1900, we had almost 2 million people living here. And with it came some problems. One of the bigger problems was the river. It just like literally became a garbage can. And I'm talking about anything and everything was tossed into a river. So our fresh water comes from Lake Michigan. So we would have, you know, intake valves extend maybe a half a mile or so out into the lakefront. They would draw in all that fresh water, but you know, with all that, you know, garbage kind of floating out there, it became not quite far enough away. So we extended even further out, and that became not far enough away. The threats of cholera and things like that became very, very real. So we found kind of a unique way of dealing with it. What we did was we dug a ditch a little bit further south than we're going to be going. But anyway, long enough and deep enough and wide enough that we're able to do something that even today is considered to be one of the greatest engineering feats of all time. All right, quick blow on the whistle already. So what we did was we reversed the flow of the Chicago River. This completed the year 1900. This was a major development. I mean, this was a project that was bigger than the digging of the Panama Canal. More earth was moved for this than for the Panama Canal. It's considered again to be one of the greatest engineering feats of all time. So instead of now all that garbage floating out into Lake Michigan, it would begin to make its way south, down towards the Illinois River, towards the Mississippi River, and this is usually where I ask if anybody here is from St. Louis.
Yes.
You from St. Louis? Okay, well you were not too happy with us because of course the first major city that all of our garbage would come across would be St. Louis. You did file suit against us, but we kind of did it the old Chicago way. We opened up the locks before it ever got to court. The idea is over time and over distance that the water would purify itself and oxidize itself, and you know, you look normal, so I think the concept did work. You see normal? So I think the concept did work. Some of you may have heard that St. Louis still really very much wanted to get even with us, and they found kind of a unique way of doing it. What they did was they decided to take all that Chicago water and bottle it up, and they sent it back to us. I think you call that Budweiser. I'm not 100% sure about that. It's as good as it gets, guys. I'm warning you about that one. So, let's see. Let's talk about the Chicago flood. April 1992, a beautiful sunny day, almost just like today, but even a warmer day, warm sunny day, and Chicago floods. How do you flood on a beautiful sunny day? Well, if you take a look alongside these bridges here, you'll see these wooden pilings. They're kind of placed there to kind of keep the barges from running into the bridges back in the days when we had so much commercial traffic. And from time to time, they need to replace or repair some of these pilings. And they're replacing some pilings that are located under, not this bridge, but the next bridge after us, the Kingsey Street Bridge. And they accidentally put you into a tunnel system. Now, this wasn't some little ordinary tunnel system. This was an enormously elaborate tunnel system that connected a lot of these outletting railroad terminal stations that allowed a lot of the downtown office buildings and department stores. It was used for delivering of goods, things like that. It even had a rail system that operated underneath there. They pretty much just stopped using it in the 1950s, and they didn't think much else about it. But when they punctured into the system, all of a sudden buildings in the downtown area were calling up about their basements rapidly filling up with water. They realized what they did when they saw this kind of eddy of water swirling over here. They threw mattresses in there, anything they could to stop the flooding. The result was very much of a disaster here in Chicago. We virtually had to shut the entire downtown area down for 3 or 4 days. All kinds of electrical problems, things like that. And, you know, we're very much an international city with our banking and our commodity exchanges, so definitely expensive and definitely embarrassing. And again, happening just after the next bridge on the left-hand side over here. So I mentioned during the introduction the Trunnion-Baskill Bridge. I'm not sure if I did mention that we have more operational bridges here in Chicago than any other city in the world. Anytime you hear the term Trunnion-Baskill Bridge or Chicago Bridge, it's pretty much an interchangeable term. You know, really good example is this bridge that's kind of stuck in the opposition right in front of you. It's an old railroad bridge. It's kind of a beloved bridge here in Chicago. We've even landmarked it. It used to be for delivering of newsprint to the old Chicago Sun-Times building, which was torn down to make way for Trump Tower, which of course we'll talk about a little bit later on the tour here today. But you get a good sense of how it works, again, as you go by there. Again, it works on a system of weights and counterweights. It looks like there'd be a lot more stress in it because it's in the opposition, but it really makes no difference whether it's in that up or down position. So you get a good view of the counterweight there, and you can also kind of peek to the left and see how those railroad tracks kind of cut underneath all the buildings on the left-hand side, pretty much going up along all the buildings on that side of the river that we'll be seeing a little bit later on, pretty much up to where we started the tour over at Michigan Avenue. So you get a good little view over there. Again, a good sense of how those bridges work. Okay, I mentioned I wanted to revisit 333 West Wacker Drive from a different vantage point. It's going to be coming up here in just a bit once we clear this residential building on the left-hand side that we talked about earlier, that designed by BKL. It'll say Nuveen at the top, and it's going to be what I think is a really good photo op. It's going to really pick up the skyline of Chicago. You'll see the Merchandise Mart on the left-hand side, and I'm telling you, very often if you're watching any interviews of people from Chicago, this is the exact backdrop that they use for these interviews, and you'll see just what I'm talking about here as it comes into play over here on the left-hand side. I think you can all see it now. That's again the Merchandise Mart on the left-hand side. It's got that wonderful curve in it again that echoes the curve in the Chicago River.